Major funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Chubb Group of Insurance Companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers.
They want to take my house and make it a visitor center because they think it's so nice.
The National Park Service wants this man's house. It's creating a park, preserving landscape, animals, but what about people?
It's inevitable when you do something this big that some people aren't going to want it.
Tonight on Frontline, the policy and practices behind the making of a national park that was supposed to be for the good of all.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTVS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is Frontline with Jessica Savage.
It is rarely, if ever, that we get to see a story about the implementation of a government program, charting its effects on the lives of people over time and outlining the details of how it worked. But two filmmakers documented such a story. For 3 years, they followed what happened to a small community in Ohio when the National Park Service went about the making of a national park, the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. It was a part of the drive back in the mid-'70s to greatly expand the size and the number of parks in America. Now, what these filmmakers discovered was a classic political story, a story about good intentions, bureaucracy, and a struggle, pitting individual homeowners against those acting for the good of all. Unfortunately, what happened here with this park is not an isolated case. During the period when this film was shot, 1979 through 1982, thousands of families across this country had their houses and their properties turned into parkland. Tonight, the film For the Good of All, produced and directed independently by Mark and Dan Jury, and produced for Frontline by Stephanie Tepper. Cleveland, Ohio. This is where the Cuyahoga River caught fire in 1969 and became a byword for pollution. But just 8 miles upstream is the beautiful Cuyahoga Valley. In 1974, Congress declared this area a national park. But the coming of the park was to bring irrevocable change to the lives of the people who lived here. Before the park, the Lindley family had farmed in the valley for 100 years.
I was born and raised on a farm, and when I was 9 years old, my dad was on a 280-acre farm. He caught his hired man sleeping out in the field instead of working, so he fired him. So I took over for him, and I've been at it ever since.
I grew up, was born in the same house as my dad was. It's just beautiful in the area. Just a different atmosphere than anywhere else in the world.
Before the park, Bill Erdos and his family lived in the home he'd built with his own hands.
It took me several years to do it because of limited funds and because I was doing it in my spare time after work and weekends and things like that. We had a new house by the time we were done. We submitted it to Architectural Record, and it was selected as one of the 20 outstanding homes in the country for 1977.
Before the park, One of the small businesses in the valley was the flower shop.
Good afternoon, Natalie Florist.
Bob Volkanoff had built the shop, and his wife Natalie ran it for 28 years.
Very few people know our last name because my first name's Natalie and they just think it's Natalie Florist. They just obviously, and they call my husband Mr. Natalie, which he doesn't like very much.
I'm Mr. Natalie.
Before the park, Burl Tonkin was the local handyman.
I went to the Army in the spring of 40, and I come back in 46.
Burl could turn his hand to any kind of job. Sometimes he'd help out a neighbor for a couple of dollars.
I made a living, didn't get rich or anything, but I was doing a useful thing, I thought. Something I like to do, which is worth quite a bit.
Before the park, Leonard Stein Sapir had hoped his children would grow up here.
One of my primary reasons for wanting to move out here and raise a family here was because of the makeup of the community. It was just a lot of different people who all seemed to get along together. People with integrity and individuality, and no one was trying to rip anybody off. They were just trying to live here and take care of the environment and be by themselves, be private people living quiet lives.
This is the story of what happened to these people when the National Park Service came to the valley. It's a story of more than local interest, because it questions whether a federal bureaucracy like the Park Service thwarted the will of Congress, ignored the law of the land, and overrode the rights of individuals. It's a story about power and confrontation, about a large federal bureaucracy up against a small community. Now, the people who created the park were idealists. They believed that a park for all people for all time was for the greater good. They believed that a park should preserve a place of peace and tranquility for the many people who would come here from our overcrowded cities. But what about the local community, the people we've just met? Should the park be created at their expense? That is not what Congress originally intended. When the law was being written, Congressman Seiberling, the author of the legislation, and a man whose own home was in the park, said, "We're not just talking about the conservation of a piece of land. We're talking about the conservation of people as well. In planning the park, the people must be considered as a resource, as well as the trees and the flowers and the birds and the waterfalls."
1, 2, 3, 4.
At first, the local people welcomed the idea of living inside the park.
Rolling my sweet baby's arms, rolling my sweet baby's arms. I'm gonna lay around the shack till the mail train comes back, and I'll roll in my sweet baby's arms.
Here, they'd always been conservation-minded.
Fortunately, every governmental subdivision, village, and township within the valley in Summit County were pioneers in zoning for the protection of the valley. Protection from industry, commercialism, and multiple housing units. None were permitted.
People thought the Park Service would carry on the good work.
It's my pleasure today to introduce to the fellow members of the Rotary Club of Shaker Heights the Superintendent of the Cuyahoga Valley, Mr. Bill Birdsell.
Thank you, Bob. It's a real privilege to be up here today to tell our neighbors up here in the east side of Cleveland, the east side of Cuyahoga County, a little bit more about your national park, the national recreation area that's being developed down the Cuyahoga Valley. So with that, we'll pull the curtains and show you some pretty pictures.
For Bill Birdsell, the opportunity to create what he liked to call a park for all people for all time was to be the peak of his career. Congress, the courts, the National Park Service, and a $35 million budget gave the superintendent almost unlimited power within the valley. Birdsell now set out to create his park with an ambitious program of land acquisitions.
In 1974, legislation was enacted to establish the Cuyahoga Valley as a national recreation area to preserve that scenery, natural, historic for the public for all time. National Park Service did enter within days of enactment and began land acquisition.
When we look at the valley, we can see that it's 32,000 acres set aside. Right now, the only areas that are under Park Service operation are the 8 metro park areas. The rest of the acreage, the light green section, marks private citizens' land that is being bought up slowly but surely, and then will lead to further development of picnicking areas and things of that nature. Some of this land is already bought, but they're still in the process. The Lands Acquisitions Office is still in the process of purchasing all of the land area.
The local homeowners had always known that the park would have to acquire land, but they believed official assurances that only a handful of houses would be compulsorily purchased. So what happened next came as a rude shock to many of them.
Now, for some strange reason, they need my house. The needs have changed. The first one was to put in a horse trail that ran through here down there. Now you can see, it would be an impossibility to put a horse trail down there. Well, once I pointed that out to them, all of a sudden it changed from that to when we took Bertzel's deposition, he wanted to bulldoze it because he wanted to preserve the open space. He wanted to add another couple of acres to the 30,000 acres of open space that they already had. The latest, and I think this just happened within the last month, or the last couple of months anyhow, that they now want to put it into some sort of a visitor center because they think it's so nice. They want to take my house and make it a visitor center.
Well, when they first appraised it, there was 2 young fellas come out and said, "You're not a big-time farmer," so he says it's classified as a hobby. He said, "Well, that's the way it is. We want your property, and I don't like it." I says, "Just forget about the whole thing." And he said, "Well, we'll buy it right outright."
We had received a letter from the government saying that they wanted to acquire our property in fee, and that we would be receiving a call from the appraiser to set up a time for them to come out and appraise the property. And I specifically asked why, or who made the determination and for what reasons. The standard answer that I got was, "Your property is on my list." You know, that's the kind of answer that you get. There's some mysterious, higher level person is making these decisions, and that they're not privy to the rationale. They just end up with a list and say, "Go buy this."
Well, I didn't quite believe it myself at first. I really asked the lawyer, I said, "Well, suppose we just ignore the sons of bitches." And he said, "Well, you can't do that." I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, they'll send armed men and take it away from you." And, well, that didn't worry me a great deal, except for Grandma, that would tear her all to pieces if I went that way. And so I decided that do the best I could and just get out. Well, she's going to go with me.
I'm going to go with him. He's all I got. My husband's dead. And I've got no daughter.
Slowly but surely, boarded-up houses with government no trespassing signs became common sights in the valley. The U.S. National Park Service's program of acquisition was turning out to be far more extensive than anything Congress and the local people had ever imagined. Now, Congress had provided 2 ways for the Park Service to acquire property. If purchased outright, the owner would lose his house, but he still could choose to stay in it, in theory, for up to 25 years as a tenant of the government. This was called a fee title purchase. Many homeowners objected to becoming temporary tenants in a dying community. So when their homes were purchased, they took the money and left. In the second form of acquisition, an owner could make a deal with the government. He could keep his house and become a part of the park if he promised not to make any changes to the property. This was known as a scenic easement. Scenic easement was cheaper than fee purchase. It would have preserved the community. and it was clearly what Congress had intended.
The law said that fee title purchase should only be used in special circumstances. Despite this, Superintendent Birdsall admitted under oath in 1979 that more than 300 homes had been taken in fee. Only a few easements had been given. The man who sponsored the legislation was the same Congressman Seiberling who'd originally spoken of conserving the people along with the land. Publicly, he gave his support when a halt on further purchases was called for by the people whose homes were threatened by the park. But he was determined to create a park for his constituents in Akron. So privately, Representative Seiberling seemed to support the Park Service seizing more homes. This Park Service document shows Seiberling both encouraging scenic easements and also advocating more condemnations and more declarations of taking.
Congressman Seiberling, in his statements before congressional committees prior to the passage of this act, specifically stated that no more than 25 to 30 homes would have to be eliminated from the area to establish this recreation area.
Congressman Seiberling has stated this publicly, and to me personally, there was never any intent to protect a community.
Preserving the community would have added charm to the park. It would have lowered the cost of administration and would have lowered the cost of acquisition. It was absolutely ludicrous for them to do this. But the Park Service has a mindset that all parks should be devoid of people. You can preserve trees, you can preserve birds, you can preserve woodchucks, but people have got to go.
It's been very clear that throughout the entire thing, and I've attended the hearings for this park and have been here since its inception, and there was never any intent for a protection of a community in the sense within the park. The law is very clear. It says that we are to establish a national recreation area to meet the needs for urban recreation in this metropolitan area. And of course you cannot do that and still protect everyone's interests who happen to live within a geographic area.
KOP 731 Echo.
731, 3 Delta 12. I'll be out of the security check of the Rohack property on Myers Road.
So the Park Service continued to close doors all over the valley to make sure that the houses it had bought remained locked up. The Park Service sent armed rangers out on patrol. But these purchases cost so much more than scenic easement that they helped push up the estimated price of the park from $35 to $166 million. These cost overruns were not the only cause for concern. A storm of criticism came from those who were losing their homes. They charged that the Park Service was high-handed and inconsistent. Ranger Fred Reese.
Anytime you come into an area that's already established and basically mandated by the U.S. Congress to set up a park with people already living in an area, I don't really think that it's possible not to have a PR problem.
This PR problem led area newspapers, like the now defunct Cleveland Press, to headline the park's treatment of the tiny community. This local affair became a regional issue after a series of articles by reporter Peter Almond.
The idea for the series on the Cuyahoga Valley Park came about through our desk and our city editor, who had been in touch with the various community groups who had been protesting what the Park Service had been doing for quite some time. So I was called on to just take a look. And my inclination, both my inclination of myself and my city editor, who were both outdoor types, was that there must be something wrong with the homeowners. You know, this is a noble concept, something that the press, in fact, had been pushing for some years. But I went out and just started looking around. It took about a month, and I just drove from one end of the park to the other, and I became aware that there were indeed a lot of problems, and things just didn't seem right. I went through this little village of Everett, and seeing all these places boarded up with big stickers on there, U.S. government property, keep out, you really begin to wonder, well, why is all this being done? And that's how come we kind of came to concentrate on this question of really what's going on. I don't think anybody had been objecting to the fact that there was going to be a park. It was just the way that it was being done.
One of Peter Allman's stories focused on the A-frame owned by Leonard and Beverly Phillips.
I just drove up Chaffee Road in Sycamore Hills and said, I wonder what's down here. The rest of the development was untouched, but the 3 houses at the end were not. And so I knocked on the door and started talking to Mrs. Phillips.
The reason they were going to take these 3 homes here is because down from the valley, you know, like in the summer or winter months and that there, you could see the houses. And they didn't want anything, you know, shown in the park. So that's when they approached us and they told us that they were going to take these 3 houses here.
That A-frame that he refers to is visible from down in the valley as an intrusion as you're walking through the valley in the Pinery Narrows and look up. So for those reasons, the trail going there and the visibility, that property was acquired.
Well, I stood on that property and looked down. I couldn't even see the river. And I thought that this was an interesting story. I drove around to the other side of the valley, and on the rim, I couldn't even see the across the other side. Now, this, of course, was March. The trees hadn't yet come out into full flower, a full leaf. And so you could see all the way through, and I couldn't see what they were talking about.
The A-frame was on the very edge of the park, barely 50 feet inside the official park boundary. In fact, as this map shows, it was located in the narrowest part of the park. There are no roads here and hardly any visitors. But other houses were allowed to remain, some of them in the most beautiful and most visited parts of the park. For instance, close to Hale Farm, one of the park's most popular attractions is the home of an influential local newspaper editor whose home was spared. The owner was one of the few granted a scenic easement, even though his house is barely 600 feet from the entrance to Hale Farm. Critics charged the Park Service with inconsistency. They also raised questions about the park's treatment of small businesses, like Natalie Volkanov's once thriving flower shop.
We were angry. Here we are, we've established ourselves in this area, and then all of a sudden to have somebody come up and say, hey, you got to move. We want your property.
I cry a lot. I'm bitter. I've lost a lot of weight, and I've aged.
We were told what we were supposed to get and what we were going to do, and that was it, whether we liked it or not. Well, upon refusing that, then we were told that if we did not accept their offer, that we could face condemnation. 90 days is not near enough time to move a business that's been here for 28 years.
Well, the flower shop itself is a commercial operation that was incompatible with the park being developed as a public use, and so that had to go. The house eventually be disposed of, as will the floral shop. We try to find adaptive use of any of the structures we can if there's an administrative need, but the size of that shop and its location, we don't project any use for that at the present time. It'll be simply obliterated and become public use area along the river there.
But just a short distance up the river, a much bigger commercial enterprise had been spared by Birdsall. Here in the very center of the park, on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, was the Jate Paper Mill. Though the mill was clearly an eyesore, escalating costs had left the Park Service unable to afford it for the foreseeable future. Smaller concerns, like John Zale's, were supposed to go. He'd raised sweet corn and sold it to tourists in the summer. Bob Bishop, who grew Christmas trees for the winter season, had his business bought up and closed down. One of those who could make no sense of this was their neighbor, Lily Flater.
The federal government did not invent this. This was all here before. And the local people knew what brought people here. They came to buy sweet corn and vegetables. They came to buy Christmas trees. They came to drive through the roads. And what are the first things that the government does? Say, you can't raise this sweet corn here. That's not compatible. You can't sell Christmas trees. That's not compatible. If they wanted to go about closing something off so that nobody could use it. They couldn't be doing a better job than they're doing right now, I would think.
At park headquarters, Bill Birdsell continued to work on his master plan. The park superintendent was supposed to draw up a detailed plan of acquisition and make it available to the public according to the congressional act that created the park.
We had to determine in planning this park with the public input which areas would be actually acquired in fee and would therefore be public lands open to the public as called for by the enabling legislation.
Though he often talked about his plan, the public was kept in the dark. Peter Almond.
I asked the Park Service, do you have a plan? And they produced a master plan, but it wasn't an acquisition plan. It didn't say how they were going to obtain the houses and or any other properties and in what order and why. And from what I could read of the original authorization by Congress, that was definitely required to have an acquisition plan, and I didn't see one.
For those protesting against the park, this was a crucial omission. It deprived them of their legal right to know the intentions of the Park Service. Their confusion and uncertainty meant that effective opposition was only organized when it was too late.
They're buying homes for hundreds of thousands of dollars that they don't need, and they're bulldozing them. I mean, it's sheer lunacy. They're destroying homesteads that have been in the same hands for generations for no reason.
We are for the original concept of the park, which was to preserve the area, to keep the trees, to keep the people living here, to have the farms maintained, to keep the village intact. That's what we're fighting for and protesting for.
The protesters were very bitter that Congressman Seiberling was one of the few who was enjoying a scenic easement which enabled him to keep his home in the park, while so many others were forced to go.
That's democracy. You'll never find in any group everybody agreeing. It's inevitable when you do something this big that some people aren't going to want it. The primary thing is that the public interest must be served. And as far as I'm concerned, my personal interest and everyone else's personal interest that lives in this valley is secondary to the public interest.
What I'm trying to say is a bureaucratic agency has trampled the rights of people illegally.
Well, you're using emotional words like trampled the rights.
What's wrong with emotional words? We're talking about people's homes.
I don't know. I think
It's just ironic that in the time that we have lived here, there have been so many battles. The people of the valley have worked so hard to preserve it as it is, and they did such a good job that it was desirable as a national recreation area. But you can't help but wonder if the people who came in and said, well, this is lovely, we'll take it, have any idea of what went into keeping it this way. There were all these battles over the high tension lines that were going to go right through town. So we lost that one, but still we won something because they painted them green and moved them over a little bit. 271 originally was going to cut right through the center. Do you know what's involved in once the engineers have a road on the map and getting them to move that? You can't imagine. And the people of the valley did all that. It seems as if the whole time we were here, we were always working on something like that, and so were our neighbors. And so what do you get for all that? You know, out.
It's like any other public project. Some people are affected for the good of all. And it goes right back to the Constitution of the United States, where a man's property is his and inviolate unless there is a need for the good of all, and then therefore it must be subservient. The right of eminent domain. And so this is what we're doing in our land acquisition. We're very comfortable that it's been well planned. It has not in any way been arbitrary. It's been well established, well thought out. Hundreds of hours of experienced manpower has gone into developing this plan. And while it is in conflict with some individuals, we still believe it is certainly within our mandate and what we were charged to do.
Having acquired the homes, the Park Service enlisted the aid of the local fire department.
The firefighters were taking a training session today. The house is part of the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and it was slated for demolition. We gained permission from the Park Service and the EPA to burn it instead of just demolishing it. That way they get rid of the house and we get the benefit of training at the same time. We'll be here all day until this house is completely down to the ground. What will be here at the end of the day? That slab, and this will be a slab too. That'll be all that's here. And they'll send a bulldozer in to take it away, and this will all be considered as reclaimed ground for the forest.
How often do you do this kind of exercise?
As often as we can get a place to destroy. Not many people want to volunteer their homes.
As the fires inflamed the passions of the community, more local reporters began to take notice.
WJKW TV8, Cleveland.
Property owners in Peninsula are really upset, saying they're losing their land to the government. News Center 8 City Cam reporter Dale Solly is standing by with a live report on tonight's angry town meeting. Dale?
Well, Judd, the residents are angry because of the Cuyahoga National Recreation Area, a 32,000-acre park between Cleveland and Akron. The people of the valley say that park is costing them their homes.
They're taking these homes because in the mind of some bureaucrat, it would be better to remove them and have open space than have a family living there, paying taxes and raising their children there.
The residents charge the Park Service is coercing them out, pressuring them into selling their homes for parkland. In between the shouting, Congressman John Seiberling tried to explain the government's view that the park is bigger than what the residents want.
The concerns of the several hundred people that live in this valley are very important. But the concerns of the millions of people who are going to use this park are also important.
The residents aren't against the park, only against what they call the destruction of their community. However, what their efforts to save that community will do remain to be seen.
In his efforts to save the community, Leonard Stein Sapir went to Washington in the summer of 1980. He still hoped to persuade the Park Service to stop buying houses. So as president of the Homeowners Association, he arranged a meeting with the head of the National Park Service, Russell Dickinson.
What he was generally expressing was the kind of concerns that many of the homeowners in the National Recreation have about the future, where they're headed, and the impact of the National Recreation Area project on their lives. And we had an exchange of views, and they have now gone on their way.
My feeling was that this is a large corporation. The Interior Department is a large corporation. He's the executive head of it. They have a subsidiary company in the Cuyahoga Valley where there are a few problems, and he will do what he can to see if there are problems. It was very clinical, devoid of any emotion.
One of the things that's associated with parks is open space, but in establishing a new area, such as a national recreation area where you have residential communities already in place, the question is always how much residential space ought to be allocated and how much open space. And essentially that seems to be the continuing question.
The open space concept was one which, as I understand it, helped to create the Yellowstone and all the famous parks out in the West where they wanted to maintain the natural beauty. But this was not just going to be an open space kind of park. There was communities involved. And that's the reason why it was not called a park, it was called a National Recreation Area. I wondered whether the National Park Service and those in Washington understood what it was that they were trying to create here in the Cuyahoga Valley.
What they were trying to create was a wilderness park where every tree and flower and animal would be protected by federal laws. The laws were strictly enforced and became a new source of bitterness for the local people.
The party sold their property to the park, retained rights to live there. Their dog killed a groundhog.
And the park ranger came by.
He said, "Is this your dog?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, he just killed a woodchuck in the corner." And I said, "Well, the farmer that has that little garden down the road, he'll be coming up and thanking me."
They charged the lady with harassing the groundhog or the woodchuck. Not the dog. So, of course, I guess the dog couldn't be.
And said they would have to pay a $15 fine or else go to court.
And I asked him, I said, well, my husband's got a garden out here. You mean if the woodchuck comes in there and any self-respecting woodchuck is going to eat cabbage and lettuce instead of weeds, you mean that we can't do nothing about it? He said no.
The Park Service had also said no to all of the Volkanovs' appeals to continue to run their business in the valley. So in the spring of 1980, the time had come for them to leave their home next to the flower shop.
You want me to tell you something? I caught Bob vomiting yesterday. He's so nervous and so upset that he's holding his stomach like this, and he doesn't want to move. I mean, it's affecting him more than me.
Well, what you're standing in is my ideas.
You build it.
I designed this house and built it.
But like I said, in this half-mile area, there's been 6 houses torched, and if I see this house go up in
Well, we've been here for 30-some years.
24 here and right
Well,
next
we've
door.
lived here, you know.
I couldn't do it. That's all there is to it. I wouldn't even go.
That's what Bob said to me yesterday. Or no, last week. I started packing things from the cupboard. And he cussed. He says, gosh darn it. He used different words. He says, good packing. He says, I'm not going to move. I says, Bob, we have to. He says, well, I'm going to tell the park we're not moving. I says, Bob, we have to. So I just kept on packing.
That's one of the things that, yeah. I brought Nellie home from the hospital with a new baby, which is our youngest. She was born on April 8th, and that's when we moved into the house. So now we'll start all over again. So, well.
After 3 generations in the valley, leaving came hard to the Lindleys.
They claimed they were going to beautify the park, and destroying landmarks. Has been there for way over 100 years. It hurts. I spent a lot of hours, a lot of hard work, had them come along and tear it down. It was all you could take.
I elected and chose a career to be a public servant, and it's very satisfying to me to know that I'm preserving something for people for all time, and playing a major role in that. There's certainly no personal gain for me. I won't be here 25 years from now to enjoy the benefits of the park, but I get a great deal of satisfaction in knowing that it's something that is going to be here in perpetuity and a major project that's going to benefit the public forever.
Birdsell was never to see his vision become a reality. His clashes with the public made him too controversial a figure. In Washington, the Park Service hierarchy decided to move him aside. It was a shattering blow for Bill Birdsell.
3 or 4 months after the series had appeared in the paper, Birdsell was reassigned. But Birdsell didn't leave the valley. He died, had a heart attack, and died as he was cleaning out his desk, I understand, in August.
Shortly before Birdsell's death, the land acquisition policies of the National Park Service were criticized in this government report. Senior Group Director Roy Kirk.
In our reports, we recommend that the Park Service sell back lands to private property owners where they either acquired lands inconsistent with the intent of the Congress or where they really weren't needed for the purposes of the area.
In 1981, a second government report confirmed many of the criticisms that had already been leveled at the Cuyahoga Valley Park. Senior evaluator Phil Olson.
As it turns out, you have less than 1% of the people's property being acquired in scenic easement. for all intended purposes, almost 99% of the park is going to be acquired in fee simple.
What we'd like to see is the Park Service justify through land protection plans and management plans where they need to acquire land in fee title, or where they could use alternatives such as easements or rely on zoning.
According to enabling legislation, the area was supposed to come up with a land acquisition plan as to how they would acquire the properties. It was supposed to be completed by December 1975. Well, that plan never came about until 1980, and it was only made available to the landowners in June of 1980, first time they saw a formal land acquisition plan. As a result, many homes were being bought without the people really understanding what the intent was behind a lot of the Park Service's action.
Taken together, the two government reports formed an indictment of the Park Service's land acquisition policies. With so much controversy surrounding the park, Birdsall's successor, Louis Albert, decided to keep a low profile and steer a middle course.
It's like walking a tightrope sometimes, because there are clearly conflicting interests. There are some people who think this recreation area should be perhaps paved over and made into one big ORV system. There's another group that says, no, all they want is 3 million miles of equestrian trails. Everyone has their own interest or series of interests. And I see my job as being one of balancing those interests and, wherever possible, satisfying the public's needs where it can be done in consistence with a broader national policy and national function of the national park system. Certainly, our acquisition of properties was displacing people, creating hard feelings, some of which were justified perhaps, some of which weren't. I'm not going to make the value judgment now, but some hard calls had to be made.
Albert's judicious balancing act meant that he wouldn't condemn any new homes, but he wouldn't give any back either. So in the winter of 1981, despite the government reports and a new park administration, the local residents were left exactly where they'd always been, on the way out.
It's like a military operation, you know. They don't have much compromise at all. There's no give, there's no flexibility to them at all. They say they're going to do something, and they go ahead and do it. Yeah, this is the end. This is the end. Yeah, this is the end of the Tompkins in the valley here. They're all gone now, except me and Grandma.
But by the end of that winter, it seemed there might be grounds for hope. In Washington, at the Department of the Interior, a new secretary, James Watt, was appointed by the budget-conscious Reagan administration. Watt's new policies seemed like a last-minute reprieve to the homeowners.
Secretary Watt has established a moratorium on land acquisition, except in those cases where apparently it's under court order, or there is definitely a hardship, or it's really critically needed to acquire the land to protect a resource.
Transworld Airlines, Flight 101.
So in the spring of '81, Leonard Stein Sapir arranged a second meeting in Washington. On his first trip, he'd put his case to the head of the National Park Service, but after 8 months, he was still waiting for a reply. This time, he was meeting with the top officials in the Department of the Interior. Ray Arnett, an undersecretary, was among those present.
Over 400 out of the original 500 residences have either been acquired in fee already or are presently in condemnation. What the Park Service is doing now is they're taking homes that were purchased, homes that are worth $40,000, $50,000, $100,000, and they're giving them to the local fire department to burn for practice.
They tried to manage it like Yosemite. Exactly. So you've got an elite cadre in the National Park Service who are trained, who have spent 20 years in managing national parks as natural areas.
Well, there's another factor, too, that nobody mentioned. That is that the Park Service contracted with the Corps of Engineers to perform the acquisitions. The Corps ain't in the habit of going out for easements. They want to flood something.
And the most poignant
central fact is that the people did not have to be kicked off their land in order to have a wonderful park. They could have stayed.
It's not dead yet.
It is not. It's not dead yet.
There are three classes of situations. There are the people who are in condemnation right now but have not lost title to their property. Our recommendation would be that those condemnations be dismissed immediately by the government. Number two, there's the classification of people who are living under a scenic easement or a term of years. Our recommendation with respect to those people, and that's well over 100 people. Matter of fact, Birdsall testified about 172, I believe, in 1979. Living under a scenic easement or a term of years. Our recommendation with respect to those people is that they be permitted to buy back the interest in their land that they had to give up to the government. In other words, give the government back its money, less some amount to compensate them for the inconvenience, and they get back full fee title to their property.
Well, subject to a scenic easement, however, so they can't commercially develop it.
You mean the homes that are there that have been purchased? Give them back their money and give them their homes.
Exactly.
They'd agree to that.
They'd agree to that, absolutely.
So happy I can't tell you.
Looks good. And we spoke with people in authority. We spoke to among others, the Undersecretary of the Interior, the second man in command in the Department of the Interior. And as Tom says, they were sympathetic.
But for some Valley residents, this possible solution had come too late.
This Stein Sapero, he called me one day and he said, would you be interested in buying your old property back? He said, we're working on something now through the government that the old homesteaders could buy back their old property. I said, well, you're just a little bit late. I said, there's nothing left. First, they tore the barn down. Our neighbor Alexander's told us that they came in with bulldozers and leveled the house right down and covered up the basement. I don't know whether they did anything with a well or not. They just deliberately tore it down and hauled it away in trucks.
There's just no word to express it, the feeling that it leaves you with. And also that our ancestors aren't here, any of them, to see this happen, because I don't think any of them could have taken it.
The months passed, and gradually the hopes raised by the meeting in Washington began to fade.
Never heard a word. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Since the euphoria of that meeting, where it appeared as though new people were in power who were sympathetic to our cause, we've really heard nothing. The bureaucracy here has not changed, and it appears as though the bureaucracy in Washington is more involved with higher political things than the welfare of a community in the Cuyahoga Valley.
Only a few could afford the money and time to fight the government, so more and more people were leaving the valley.
You have to have some authority, you know, to have a planning and having progress. But they could do it a lot more gently than they did, I think. People, the residents of the valley, and not causing near as much disruption as they have. But I guess they've chased all the riffraff about out now, so they get us out, I guess they can do what they want.
With the destruction of the community nearly complete, Leonard Stein Sapir was to make one last trip to Washington. This time, the House Interior Appropriations Subcommittee heard his appeal. But the committee was hostile. When forced to sell open land, he'd made a profit. Some on the committee questioned his motives, implying that his efforts to save his home were insincere.
Our community and way of life has been destroyed at great human cost.
Because of the creation of the park.
Yes, at great financial cost, and most tragically, to no good purpose, all in the name of preservation. Practically without exception, everyone in the valley was in favor of the creation of the recreation area because we knew that eventually developmental expansion would take its toll. However, both our community and Congress were told that an act had been structured that would preserve our homes and community by means of preservation easements and that the remaining open space areas would be purchased in fee. But now, over 425 out of the original 500 homes in the original park boundaries have been bought out by the government. The tragedy of the Cuyahoga Valley has consistently been justified by its proponents as a great victory for all people, for all time. But I implore you to be suspect of those individuals who are ready to sacrifice the rights of individuals, families, and communities for general concepts of the public good with no responsibility of a burden of proof. We're fighting this battle, we feel, for all of us, because if we lose this lonely battle, we feel that we will all be the less for it.
It's a beautiful picnic area, no question about it. But there was a home here. We never see anyone using it. Why did the home have to go out of 32,000 acres? And it's inconceivable to me that Congress could specify in the enabling legislation that this community was to be allowed to remain here, and that this was ignored.
Today, the Lindley family property, like others in the valley, is open space. Bob and Evelyn have purchased a new farm near Hudson, Ohio. They say they will never go back to the valley. This was once the Volkanovs' flower shop. Now the Park Service says it may invite some businesses to come back to the valley. But it's too late for Bob and Natalie. They've moved their shop to a mall in Akron. The Erdos home is one of those now owned by the government. It is still unclear how the Park Service plans to use it. So the family will build a new home, once again, from the ground up. Bill Erdos expects the job will take him 10 years. The little town of Everett remains empty and boarded up. Now there's talk of making it an artist colony. This house, on the edge of town, once belonged to the Tonkins. Like many others, it will be destroyed. Burl and Grandma have a new place. She is 90 and still in good health. After 4 years in federal court, Leonard Stein Sapir's home was acquired by the government on Christmas Eve, 1982. The family remains in its home, but their children are growing up in a dying community. The school system has been disrupted. 2 of the churches are closed, and the library is struggling to survive. Leonard continues to fight the government through a class action lawsuit that he intends to take to the Supreme Court. When the park was created, it was meant for the good of all. It was meant to preserve the community. It was done with the best of intentions. But perhaps it is in pursuit of the greatest good that we should take the greatest care. The fight over parks continues, but there are ironic twists to the story. Yet another switch in federal policy has occurred since this film was completed. Secretary of the Interior James Watt has ordered park managers to come up with land protection plans. That's a way of preserving existing properties short of outright acquisition. And while these plans are designed, the Park Service has delayed spending money to buy properties. And so all across the country, there's a whole new group of property owners angry at the Park Service, but for different reasons now. They want to sell, but they can't. Many testified at a congressional hearing last month, claiming the delay is hurting them financially. They are paying interest and taxes on land they can't sell to anyone else, and now can't sell to the Park Service either. And so they have become the newest group of people caught in the struggle over policies, practices, and philosophies in the making of our national parks. Next week on Frontline, a program about Russians, not the ones thousands of miles away, Russians who've been living here in America for years. 100,000 Russians have emigrated here. They've come for freedom. That's what they tell us, and that's what we expect to hear. But what do they think of America's freedom? It's democracy. The answer will surprise you. The program is called The Russians Are Here. It is next on Frontline. I'm Jessica Savage.
For a transcript of this program, please send $4 to Frontline, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for Frontline was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding was provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Chubb Group of Insurance Companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers.
For video cassette information about Frontline, write to PBS Video, Box 8092, Washington, D.C., 20024.